What up, Oasis? Hey, okay, I have a favor to ask you real quick. A couple times a year, we have this incredible team of volunteers that they just love making you food. And they don't just make you food, y'all, they make you delicious food. And so they are still in the kitchen, I believe, cleaning up. But I think if we said thank you, they might be able to hear us. Are you guys good with that? Yeah. All right, so I'm gonna count on 3, and then after 3, we're gonna say thank you. Make sense? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Y'all, that was great. Oh man, y'all did great. But y'all, we're kicking off a new series. We're kicking off a series called In the Beginning. Over the next couple of weeks, we're gonna be journeying through the first few chapters of Genesis. And these first few chapters are oftentimes stories that we heard a long time ago in like a children's picture Bible with a lot of cool, graphics on there. But they're stories that remind us of God's faithfulness. He is the same today, tomorrow, and forevermore. But I know we had a meal. And I know sometimes with meals, you kind of need a story to kind of get into something more serious. So I thought I'd share a story with you real quick. And this is the story of how I got one of my nicknames. So please don't call me this afterwards. But when I was in college, I was a senior, and I was working on this group project, and my group was notorious for never showing up to work on the group project. And so I had already been I had already shown up a couple times, they didn't show up, and this is like the 3rd time we've scheduled to work on this project, and I'm sitting in the library, and I'm waiting there. They're still not there. I'm texting them, 5 minutes go by, they're still not there, and I don't know what to do, so I just start doom scrolling on my phone. And at that time, Kansas City had recently moved a women's soccer team into the area. And I was like, man, it'd be so cool to go to a game. And I'm on my phone, and I found out they were gonna start playing that season in the summer. I was like, dude, I gotta go look at the calendar. And so I'm just doom scrolling. I now make it to the calendar, and I'm scrolling all the way down, trying to see what games I could make, what would work with my schedule. And I get to the bottom of this website, and there's a button that says careers. And I'm like, oh my gosh. I'm about to submit a resume to play left bench. This is gonna be amazing. I played soccer growing up, and I wasn't super great. I was good enough to get playing time, but I'm nowhere near professional quality. But I was like, man, if I could just play left bench, that'd be a dream. And so I go through all of these job listings, and I'm like, there's gotta be a position for me somewhere. There's not. They're all for marketing. I'm pretty bummed, but I make it all the way down to the bottom of this list. And guys, it was like God spoke my calling to me, because I read this title and it said, home game, match day, DJ. And I was like, guys, this is what I was created for. Because you see, I had actually been working in college. I worked at the rec center. I worked as a lifeguard. So Monday through Friday, I'd open the pool at 5:45 in the morning, because that's lovely to do as a college student. And I was in charge of this Bluetooth speaker. And over the 2 years that I worked at this pool, I got 3 compliments on my choice of music. And I was convinced that I was going to be a new DJ. So I fill out this application. They're asking me to submit some mixtapes. And I put in this little text box, I say, I've never made a mixtape before. I barely even know what it is. But here are the songs that I've gotten compliments on. I fill out this whole thing. I try my best to be convincing. I never got a response. It was really tough. And I was a little depressed for a couple of days, and my friends saw me, and they started making intentional ways for me to be the DJ. We'd be in the car, and they hand me the aux cord out of pity. They'd be like, here, Emily, here you go. And I remember we went to my friend's house to hang out, and they brought out 2 dishes and set them on a table, turned them upside down for my mixtapes that go right? And they ended up giving me this nickname. Guys, my last name is Kaufman. My nickname in college became DJ Cough Drop. And that is what they still call me. Please do not call me that. But I think there's just something special about music, right? You have songs you go to help you process what's going on in your life. You have songs that you've built this connection to. It's one of the reasons why I loved working at the pool, is I got to choose what we listened to. I got to play the songs that I liked. I got to play the songs that I was attached to. But music has this power, and sound has this power, in which it's not just the lyrics, but it's also the composition that helps us lean into truth. It helps us lean in and find comfort in the midst of chaos. Some of y'all in here are Swifties, and that's great. She's cool. But some of y'all are Swifties because for a decade, Taylor Swift has been able to masterfully not just compose music, but to use lyrics that hit on the everyday, ordinary chaos we experience. Like from being broken up with, to finding like your first love, to figuring out what it's like to be 22, to then getting like back together 8 times with someone you went out with that you shouldn't have gone out with before. Like any weird experience you have as an ordinary person, Taylor Swift speaks into, and this is why we love her so much. Yet in the same way, our worship music is a tool as well. Christian worship artists, they have beautifully mastered albums and songs for congregations to sing together that are composed with lyrics of truth. And sometimes I get prayer requests on the Connect cards to say like, can you play this song? And I know that it's because you have a connection to that those artists, as they prayerfully wrote those songs, that you experience the truth of God. And music has this way to help us find comfort in the midst of chaos. But for the people in the Bible, it wasn't necessarily music that did this, it was story. Story was a way of shaping a narrative to make sense of the world around them. And for the people that lived in the Old Testament, they used stories to explain everything, like from your common cold, to a drought, to famine, to even just how they got there. But the thing was that many of these cultures, they actually created a system called mythology from their stories. They actually created systems of religion based on their culture in which they believed that there were certain gods that were somewhere up in the universe, somewhere separated from them, that were trying to control everything. That if they somehow managed to do the right things, to worship them well enough, that they would somehow live a life that's worthy. And so they created stories about these gods to explain the everyday, ordinary chaos that they experienced. Yet in this same context are people called the Israelites. In the same context are people who are called to worship the one and true God. And it's like they're located and they're surrounded by all of these other nations that are doing their own thing and worshiping their own gods. And the story of the Old Testament is that this nation of Israel is called to be holy, blameless, and set apart. They are called to worship Yahweh and God alone. But we see that somehow they start adopting all of the practices that are around them. They say, well, that's working really good for Egypt. Maybe we should try that. That's really looking really good for Babylon. Maybe we should implement that. And over time, God gets really frustrated at this because he's watching how people are forgetting what he's done. He's watching how people are forgetting his faithfulness. And in the Old Testament, we see him command over and over again that his people need to write down what he did, not just for themselves, but for generations to come. And this is how we have the Bible. Like, this is how we have the very first book of the Bible. This is how we have Genesis. It's not just a story for the sake of a story. It is a story that is to reveal from the very beginning what God's character is and how it is consistent across the rest of the biblical narrative, across the rest of our lives, no matter what we experience or even what we do. This is why we have God's word. And so tonight, as we dig into Genesis chapters 1 and 2, we're looking at the very first words that were used to help people understand who God is. Genesis 1 is the beautiful account of how God created. It tells us everything he does in about 7 days. And Genesis chapter 2 is like this focus on the 6th day of creation when God creates humanity. And so if you have your Bible, we're going to start in verse 1 in chapter 1. The very, very first words that are used to proclaim who God is. And we see that it's these 4 simple words: in the beginning, God. In the beginning, God. Now, this doesn't look like much, but this is actually a declaration. And it is a powerful declaration because the very first words of the Bible are a declaration that God is the initiator and the source of all life. It's a declaration that in the beginning, there was nothing else. It was just God. And that's a little weird to wrap our mind around, but it was just God. He didn't need anything to give him life. God is life in himself. So then everything he creates finds life in him. It is a declaration that he is self-sufficient. He does not need anything to survive. And this is an exact declaration against the mythologies of every other culture that exists. Because all of the other gods that the nations worshipped found their existence in something else. They had to have something in order to be pleased. They had to have something in order to be happy. They had to have something in order to live. Yet our God, in these very first 4 words, it says, in the beginning, God, our God doesn't need anything, but he already is. He is life. And we see that the story of creation in chapter 1 is a glimpse into the Creator himself. We are not the main character, but God is. The story of creation is about the foundational truths that are carried out by an unchanging God, which leads us to ask the question, all right, who is God? And as we go throughout tonight, we're going to see that there are 3 places and there are 3 things that are revealed to us in these first 2 chapters. And the first one is this, that creation reveals that God is love. God himself is love. He creates out of a self-giving love, and this isn't a statement to gloss over, but this is what makes our God amazing. This is what makes our God distinct from every other God, every other false idol that exists, because anything else that exists that you can worship is not loving. Anything else that you can devote your life to will never give you anything in return. Yet God himself is love, and he creates because of his love. He actually makes things to share in the love that he freely has. Yet when we hear about creation, when we think about what it's like to invent something or what it's like to paint or sculpt something, a lot of times we don't see this actually happening from love. We see this coming from conflict, right? Like we create because there's something in our life that's like not as good as it should be, and we think it could be a little bit better. Like think of your heated car seat. Oh man, I don't have a heated car seat. Apparently my mom does. She texted me last week. She's like, I have heated car seats. And I was just like, winter's coming and this is awful. I have no heated car seats. And I was just like, man, I would really like a new car that would have heated car seats because my car isn't good enough. I want her car because when it gets cold and it's like -20 outside, man, I just want like my back and my other regions to like be nice and warm. And like, man, I just really want a heated car seat. And I just imagine this guy who invented the heated car seat, and he was probably like, man, this isn't good enough. Something about this isn't right. You need this when you live in South Dakota and when you live like legit in the Arctic up here. Like you need something nice and warm. Or like we could think about, y'all know how Facebook was created? It was created in 2004 by this guy named Mark Zuckerberg. He and a bunch of like his college roommates from Harvard, they made this website called thefacebook.com. And people, they just like loved it. And soon this website is like launching off platforms. Millions of people are starting to get connected outside of the College of Harvard. And soon Mark Zuckerberg starts to get into a bunch of like relational conflict with the people he's working with. He starts to like remove the shares people have from the company so that way they can't have as much influence. And he starts to become the sole owner of what was a group project. But after this, after like legit breaking relationships and friendships, he has now developed this company called Meta that not only owns Facebook, but it owns Instagram and probably a bunch of other things we don't know about. And it's worth $1.45 trillion. This guy created your entire social media platform by removing friends from his life, by creating out of conflict. Or, do I have any Harry Styles fans in the room? I got one. I like Harry Styles. So in 2022, he came out with his album, Harry's House. Guys, this thing won 3 Grammys, not counting any other international award. Harry's House won 3 Grammys. It won Best Album of the Year, Best Pop Album, and Best like Sound Engineered Album. Styles created one of like the most famous songs called As It Was. It was one of the most like fastest downloaded songs in the year of 2022, but all of this happened because he left One Direction. Yeah, that's tough. My bad, too soon. But like, had he not left One Direction, we would not have Harry's House album, or even the albums before that were also really great. We don't witness creation out of love. We witness creation out of conflict. We witness the success of people that create things because they thought that they could have more or they could have better if they left or removed himself. That is what we experience, but that is not how God creates. God didn't create because he was alone. He didn't create because he was bored. He didn't create because he was eating company. God created because he had something to share. He is a community himself. God is triune. He is the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They are 3 persons united together by a self-sacrificial love for one another. And God said, this is what wraps us up together, but what if we wrapped more people up into this? What if we like started making things and invited people to share in what we have? He's not creating because he's lacking. He's not creating because he thinks things could be better. He's creating because he has love to give and he wants to freely give it. This is why God creates. And we see that his love is not just like this abstract idea, but that he actually puts it into motion. And this is the rest of chapter 1, is God putting his love into motion. It's not just that he exists, but that he actually starts creating. Chapter 1, it's really not just like God creating beauty, but it's also God making a space where it's his holy dwelling place. Like the way he designed creation is that he would be there with them. That he would make a space that is fully crafted to like house himself and every other thing that he could create. And there's a theologian named Josh McDowell, and he writes that creation is the story of an artist effortlessly sculpting the universe amid a chorus of thankful celebration. The universe was born amid a party, stars singing, angels shouting. It was the opposite of violent conflict. It was creation from community. God doesn't just share his love, God shares his loving presence. He says, I'm not just giving you love, I'm making a space for us to share in it together. And this completely goes against the ancient religions of the time. Like in ancient mythology, the gods created so they wouldn't have to work. They make humans to do all the labor for them so they can be up, yonder in their palace, fine dining and living it up. Like people here on earth weren't good enough. Like you just hope that one day you would be worthy enough. Yet God's different. God didn't stay up yonder. God actually came down. God said, my creation is worthy of my presence because I love them. And so he made a space for us to be together. Because God has created you out of love, you are worthy of his presence. Yet as God continues to create and sculpt his sanctuary here on earth, we see that he's more than loving, but that this love bleeds into everything else that he is. We see that God is also powerful. He's also an authority. He's the guy in charge. And if we dive back into Genesis 1, we get this list of everything that God has created. And we see that it's like God's an architect that's creating a blueprint. Like there is structure to the design he is making. There's a way that his creation is called to live in. And we see that in day 1, God creates light and dark. Then he separates and orders the two and they become a system of days. Guess what? Light and dark still follow this. Light and dark still follow God's design, and God has called it good. Day 2, God separates water and forms the sky. Like there's an ocean and there's a sky. And guess what? Like millions of years later, there's still an ocean and there's still a sky. Creation still obeys, and God has called it very good. On day 3, God keeps creating. So there's a sky, but now there's also a land. And there's a variety of land. There's mountains, there's valleys, there's deserts, and there's oceans. And then God tells the land to start producing crops. So now there's flowers, and there's trees, and there's bushes. And guess what? Still today, there are mountains and valleys and deserts and trees and bushes. And God has called it good. And day 4, God looks at the sky, and he says, what if we made this more beautiful? And so he adds stars. And he adds this gigantic star called the sun, and then he adds this like other gigantic rock, and we call it the moon. And still to this day, they still operate on the same schedule. Like they still operate according to like the lunar calendar. To this day, God has still called it good. And within the first 4 days, we see that God creates an environment where life won't just exist, but where life will thrive. On day 5, God brings life to the seas and to the skies. He adds birds, he adds fish, he adds like a bunch of weird sharks and like a bunch of like microorganisms that live at the bottom of the ocean. And he says, all right, like create communities for yourself, increase and multiply. And he calls it good. And on day 6, God creates the rest of the animal kingdom, like frogs, penguins, elephants, like some of our favorite animals God creates. And he calls it good. Yet on day 6, God also creates people. And God plants his image in them, and God looks at them, and he says, you are very good. Think about this. Everything God creates, from the most beautiful mountain to the most intricate flower, is just good, but you are called very good. For 6 days, God is speaking and moving and directing elements and materials to form at his command, and they obey him, and they still obey him to this day. Land obeys where it's called to be. It doesn't touch the sky or take over territory it's not supposed to have. The sun and moon direct and how God has called them to move. Every day that God creates, everything that God creates lives in its design. because God's the designer. God is the supreme voice that has commanded, yet his voice is directed by love. And so creation knows that when they live according to God's blueprint, they live in their fullest life. Like, what happens? Okay, what happens if a goldfish decides, I'm gonna live in the sky? No. Like, what happens if, like, a bird decides, I think it'd be really cool to live in the bottom of the ocean? What happens if, like, a bear decides he's gonna, like, hibernate in an igloo in the bottom of the ocean? Like, when creation goes against how they're designed, they endure pain and suffering and sometimes even death. And so we see that when all of these animals, when all of these creatures, when all of creation lives in the blueprint that God has designed for them, they actually thrive and they flourish. You see, God's not just a voice that tells people what to do. He's not just a voice that is in charge, but his authority is shaped by love. He doesn't just give you a list of things to do because he thinks you should do them. He gives you a life. He gives you a blueprint because he loves you. And he says, this is how I know, like, when you live into this, this is how you're gonna live in freedom. This is how you're gonna walk in the fullest life possible. The commands and structures he gives are not based on how he can gain something from you, but on how he can give something for you. And we see that this love doesn't just stop at God being a loving creator and a loving authority, but it actually bleeds into God being a judge. And when we hear that God is an active judge, I think there's a couple of things that can happen. The first one is a lot of times we can think of a courtroom, like we can think of a judge. A judge is someone who is actively involved in the nitty-gritty details of life. Like, think about it. When a judge comes and is presiding over a case, they are listening to the multitudes of stories that are happening. They are examining evidence because they want to make sure that they make things right. That is their job. They say, how do we make things right? And for God to be an active judge is for God to serve his people. Yes, judges serve people. It is a public service job. And God, as an active judge, says, I won't just make a blueprint for creation, but I'm gonna make sure that I can sustain creation by being a judge, by making things right, by being there in case something comes up. And this is what God does. But a lot of times we confuse the role of a judge with the character of a judgmental person. Like, I think we've all met this middle-aged lady named Karen who shops at Hobby Lobby and sells essential oils and gets frustrated that the line is too long. And we associate God's judgment of saying this is good, this is bad with Karen, who makes judgments based off of opinions and gossip and really who doesn't care to build people up. Like, that's how we often associate God's judgment. But God is not Karen. God is good and God is loving. God desires more for you. We see that God makes judgments of how to help sustain creation according to his love and authority, and we see this clearly in Genesis chapter 2. Everything at this point has been created. Adam is living up his life. He is the head honcho of agriculture, I guess. He's hanging out with all the animals and he's taking care of the garden. But we see that what was called very good quickly changes. You see, the goodness of humanity is found in how we're designed. We're created in the image of God. We're created to be a reflection of his character. And it doesn't mean that we have the same nose or the same eye color, but it means that we get to reflect the qualities of God himself. We can reflect his love, but it also means that God has intricately designed us to reflect him. We see somewhere in chapter 2, for the very first time, God recognizes that Adam being alone is not good. In Genesis 2:18, he says it's not good for man to be alone. And the way that God wires us is also in the same way that God is wired. Just as God is wired as a community of self-giving love, our biological nature is to be a part of communities of self-giving love. You see, the way God designed our brains is that they are the only organ in our body that is a social organ. Brains actually need the presence of other brains to survive. There's a neuroscientist from Berkeley. He writes that our brains require stimulation and connection to survive and thrive. A brain without connection to other brains and without sufficient challenge will shrink and eventually die. Our brains are built to be near other human brains. And this is why isolation is so harmful to us, because it's going against how God has designed us. And this is what Adam's experiencing. He's in the garden. And yeah, he's got God, he's got identity, he's got purpose, he's got animals, but he doesn't have another brain like his. He doesn't have another brain that can just help him talk through his day. Like, he doesn't have another brain that can laugh when he like trips and falls over a shrub. Like, he doesn't have that. And God looks at it, he's like, man, like something's missing. And so God, as an active judge, he says, this isn't good, but I'm gonna make it right. And so he puts Adam in this deep sleep, and during this sleep, he like takes one of Adam's ribs and he creates Eve. And we see that the creation of Eve is really just this declaration that God is active and trustworthy as a judge. He's involved, like he sees the desires that you have, he sees what's going on in your life, and he's active in that. He's actively working to make things right. He is not just like up there ignorant of what's going on down here. God is actively involved in the lives of his people, and he actively works to make things right. And it's in this moment that we see how God's character, it blends together. God's love and authority culminate in his trustworthy nature as a judge. He doesn't avoid when things need adjusting, but he says, let me get my hands dirty and I'm gonna get in the mess with you. I'm gonna do what I can. And because he does act, we can trust him. This is who God is. He is loving. He's in charge, he's an authority. And he's someone we can trust as a judge to make things right. And we see that creation, their response is praise. Like, it's not just because of what God has done, but out of who God is, they respond with praise. They say, God, because of who you are, you're worthy. Because you've given us life, you're worthy. Because you are loving, because you are all of these things, you are worthy. Praise is the natural response of creation, not because of what God is doing, but because of who God is. Praise is giving admiration. And we see in Psalm 19 that there's this song of praise that creation is always in. We read that the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech, night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech, they use no words, no sound is heard from them, yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. Creation may not sing songs like we do. They may not use words like we do, but they are always in the process of praying. There's this constant song that is always happening in which God is receiving glory for who he is, right? Like the skies don't hide away from God's touch. But every evening we see that the skies are willing to be transformed by God's touch and to display his glory. You see, mountains, they don't like shrink because God gave them a lot of space. They take up the space God has given them. And they're confident, and they show their beauty. You see, fish, they don't try and live outside of their design, but they continually live in water. They live where God has designed them to live, and this is how creation praises. And it's not just praise when we experience good things, it's praise in all circumstances. And we see throughout the Psalms that there are times when God's people, they're not going through good things. Like, they're in exile. Sometimes their country's overtaken. Sometimes like they're just like in the dumps. Like, they're not always experiencing good things, yet they always praise. And praise is both this tool, but it's also almost like this spiritual sword that reminds us of God's character. It says, God, I may not feel this right now, but I'm going to trust that this is who you are. And for us, I think the challenge is that our praise is often determined by our perception of God. We allow our thoughts and our experiences to determine whether or not God is worthy of praise. But creation's different. Creation already knows that God is. One of my responsibilities here at Oasis is working with our podcast. And I've been doing this for about a year now. But the way the podcast works is I have a soundboard here. It's very lovely. What this soundboard does is that you plug a microphone into the back here. So I'd plug this one in here. And what the mic does is that the mic will pick up sound. Anything that's said, any joke that wasn't funny that Brennan said, it would get picked up in there. And sorry, Brennan, if you're watching. What would happen is that all of this is then funneled into the soundboard. And then I'd record it. And now this mic doesn't control how loud anything is. Actually, the board does. The mic doesn't actually control if something is good or not. The board does. But the mic influences the board. You see, if I'm screaming into this thing, I gotta turn down the level on this mic. If we're all the way up here and someone's screaming into that thing, I gotta turn this thing down. If someone's whispering, I gotta turn it back up. And I think sometimes in our life, we have thoughts and experiences that are always being spoken into, but we don't come to the soundboard. And I think God, his character is kind of like we have to find balance. And every single day, God's character is challenged by what we see, by what we witness, by what we experience. And it can kind of start to skew things and kind of make things out to be what they're not. And suddenly, what should be a beautiful symphony and what should be a beautiful sound coming out of the board is kind of just a blob where you're simultaneously blasted or you can't hear and it doesn't make sense. Like one ear hurts and the other ear can barely listen. And so this is what God's character is like. It's a lot of things that are hard to hold together, but we have to do the work in finding balance, and we do this by encountering God's truth. The reason why we have the Bible is because God commanded his people to remember what he did. And the best way to do that isn't by just like verbally sharing, but by writing it down. And so what would happen if out of the mic we quit pouring out things that are lies and putting in things that were God's truth? This is how we balance the board. God is loving, he is powerful, and he works to make things right, but we have to remind ourselves of that. Because if we don't, we're just going to hear a glob of things that are not good. But when we come to God, when we accept his invitations, we get to live in balance. And I don't know if you've ever heard a band or a symphony that lives in balance, but when they do, it's the most incredible thing you've ever heard. I think one of the best gifts that we can give to God is a life that says, all right, I'm going to live in balance. I'm going to come to you. I'm going to hear your truth. And I'm going to allow my mind and my heart to be transformed. You guys pray with me?